On the night of May 31, 2009, Air France Flight 447 took off from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, bound for Paris, France. It was an Airbus A330, one of the most advanced aircraft of its time, equipped with sophisticated systems designed to handle almost any condition. The flight was set to cross the vast Atlantic, and the route was familiar to the crew, who were well-trained and accustomed to long-haul flights. For the 216 passengers and 12 crew members on board, it was just another routine journey across the ocean. But high above the Atlantic, a storm was brewing, a storm that would play a critical role in the events that followed. The crew was aware of challenging weather patterns along their path. The Intertropical Convergence Zone, ITCZ, a region notorious for its severe thunderstorms and turbulent weather, stretched across their route. This zone, where trade winds from the northern and southern hemispheres converge, often leads to towering storm systems that pose risks to aircraft. Pilots navigating through these skies must be prepared to adapt quickly to fluctuating conditions. As they approached this zone, the crew of AF447 encountered ominous clouds and turbulence that required their immediate attention and careful maneuvering. Despite the advanced equipment and autopilot functions, navigating the ITCZ is no simple task. The Airbus A330, though built to withstand extreme conditions, still relied on the crew's vigilance and skill. Air traffic controllers monitored the flight from afar, but in the heart of the Atlantic, out of radar range, the pilots were mostly on their own. In these isolated stretches, communication becomes challenging, and real-time data about surrounding conditions is limited. As the plane entered the ITCZ, the situation rapidly escalated. Temperature changes began to affect critical systems, especially the pitot tubes, small sensors on the plane's exterior used to measure airspeed. In this stormy environment, these tubes became vulnerable to ice formation. Without the crew knowing it, the conditions outside the aircraft were setting the stage for a dangerous sequence of events. The darkness of night and the raging storm concealed these hidden threats, and within moments, the AF447 would face the first of several critical challenges. The stage was set. Now, the crew would need to react quickly, relying on both technology and instinct to overcome the obstacles ahead. As Flight AF447 continued its journey through the heart of the Intertropical Convergence Zone, the turbulence began to intensify, subtly signaling to the crew that conditions were becoming more severe. Inside the cockpit, the pilots monitored their instruments carefully, aware that unpredictable weather could make every piece of data crucial. Then, without warning, something unthinkable happened. The plane's pitot tubes, which measured airspeed, began to ice over, causing them to malfunction. The failure of the pitot tubes led to a cascade of critical issues. These sensors, which determine the aircraft's speed relative to the surrounding air, became unreliable as they iced up. As a result, the autopilot system, dependent on accurate speed data, suddenly disengaged. This was a pivotal moment, as the Airbus A330 was now under manual control in some of the most dangerous flying conditions imaginable. The pilots, taken by surprise, had only seconds to react to this abrupt shift. In the initial moments after the autopilot disengaged, the cockpit filled with warning sounds and flashing indicators, each demanding immediate attention. The junior co-pilot seated on the right took control of the aircraft, while the more senior co-pilot on the left focused on analyzing the situation. Due to the nature of the sensor failure, the aircraft's speed readings appeared erratic, with conflicting data that made it difficult for the pilots to assess their actual speed. This confusion in the readings began to influence their judgment as they tried to stabilize the plane manually. In aviation, speed control is fundamental, especially when navigating through turbulence at high altitudes. Flying too slowly could risk stalling the aircraft, while going too fast could stress the aircraft's structure. With unreliable speed data, the junior co-pilot pulled the nose of the aircraft up slightly, possibly trying to avoid descending into the unstable air below. However, this reaction set off a chain of events that would prove disastrous, as the plane started to climb rapidly, losing crucial forward speed in the process. At this altitude, where the air is thin, even small changes in the aircraft's attitude can lead to significant consequences. The A330 began to pitch upwards, climbing too steeply and too quickly, a movement that soon set off stall warnings in the cockpit. These warnings, blaring continuously, signaled that the plane was losing the aerodynamic lift it needed to stay in the air. But in the confusion of flashing lights, alarm sounds, and the rush of adrenaline, the situation became increasingly challenging to manage. As the plane climbed, the airspeed continued to drop, though the stall warnings briefly ceased, likely adding further confusion, as the crew may have interpreted it as a sign of recovery. But in reality, the aircraft was still in a critical state, teetering on the edge of control. At this moment, the crew was locked in a race against time, trying to make sense of conflicting indicators and to understand a rapidly deteriorating situation. The first signs of trouble had escalated far beyond what the crew could have anticipated. As they struggled to regain control, the challenges continued to mount, setting the stage for the next, even more critical series of decisions. As the situation in the cockpit of AF447 continued to unravel, the tension between human decision-making and technological limitations became painfully evident. With the autopilot disabled and the pitot tubes compromised, the pilots had to rely almost solely on their training, instincts, and whatever remaining data they could interpret. However, the sequence of events unfolding in the cockpit led to critical misinterpretations that would further complicate their efforts to regain control. At this point, the junior co-pilot, who was still in control, continued to hold the aircraft's nose up, a move that was inadvertently pushing the plane into a dangerously steep angle. Unaware of the exact airspeed, the crew struggled to determine whether they were climbing too quickly or risking a stall. The stall warnings had already sounded multiple times, but in the confusion they were dismissed as erroneous, possibly due to the inconsistent data and alarm overload. In their minds, they were still trying to navigate through rough weather and focused on keeping altitude, inadvertently taking the plane higher than it could sustain. One of the main factors at play here was the lack of clear communication between the pilots. The captain, who had been taking a scheduled rest break, was absent from the cockpit during these critical moments. When he returned, he found a situation that had already spiraled out of control, with both co-pilots reacting to what they perceived individually rather than as a coordinated team. This lack of a unified approach prevented them from fully understanding the gravity of the stall and from working together to correct it. Complicating matters, the advanced technology that defined the Airbus A330 also presented challenges. Designed to provide an array of automated safeguards, the plane's systems relied heavily on accurate data to function correctly. When the pitot tubes failed, these automated systems disengaged, leaving the crew without critical support at the moment they needed it most. This design, while intended to enhance safety, became a limitation under these specific circumstances, forcing the pilots to make decisions without the usual technological aid they had come to rely on. With each passing second, the plane continued to lose altitude, as the co-pilot maintained a high-pitch angle, believing this was stabilizing the aircraft. The confusion grew, as the conflicting data and auditory stall warnings did not seem to match their perception of what was happening outside the cockpit. It was a scenario where both human error and technological failure created a perfect storm, one that made it nearly impossible for the pilots to recover from their descent. As the captain attempted to regain command and understand the situation, time was slipping away. The AF447 was in a rapid descent, and the final moments were approaching. Every action taken, every misstep in judgment, was bringing them closer to an inevitable conclusion. The cockpit of AF447 was now in a state of heightened urgency as the crew wrestled with the controls, unaware of just how dire the situation had become. With the autopilot disengaged and no reliable airspeed indicators, the junior co-pilot continued holding the nose up, causing the aircraft to lose even more forward speed. This move was critical. As the plane's nose pitched higher, it climbed to an unsustainable altitude, pushing the aircraft closer to a full aerodynamic stall. By this time, the captain had returned to the cockpit, but the rapid series of events made it difficult for him to grasp the full picture. He faced an overwhelming task. Not only was he trying to interpret the chaotic data in front of him, but he also had to manage the decisions already made in his absence. In those moments, the captain sought a quick assessment, asking the co-pilots what had happened. However, the responses were fragmented, as each pilot tried to explain only parts of the unfolding disaster. The lack of concise communication continued to cloud their understanding, reducing their chances of a successful recovery. Meanwhile, the aircraft's stall warnings continued intermittently. Each time the stall alarm sounded, it sent an auditory reminder that the plane was dangerously close to losing all lift. The pitch angle remained high, and the plane was losing altitude rapidly, dropping at a rate of several thousand feet per minute. In aviation, altitude is life. The faster they descended, the less time they had to react. Yet in the intense moment, the co-pilot at the controls misinterpreted the data, believing he needed to maintain the nose-up attitude to regain altitude, unaware that this was accelerating their descent. Inside the cabin, passengers were unaware of the crisis unfolding in the cockpit. To them, it was simply a rough flight, a disturbance common to anyone who had experienced turbulence. Some may have felt anxious, others may have slept through it. The sounds of alarms and warnings, a constant in the cockpit, were not audible to those seated behind. However, the descent soon became perceptible as the plane began to shake more violently, giving the passengers their first sign that something was deeply amiss. Back in the cockpit, the situation was rapidly reaching the point of no return. The captain, realizing the severity of the descent, took hold of the controls. He attempted to level the nose, trying to bring the aircraft out of its steep pitch. But the lack of reliable airspeed data, coupled with their limited situational awareness, made it nearly impossible to assess how much control they had left. Every action he took seemed to only marginally affect the plane's trajectory as the A330 continued its fatal plunge. The pressure was mounting, and with every passing second, their altitude diminished. In those final moments, the captain and co-pilots faced an insurmountable challenge, battling against both time and physics. The controls felt heavy, a result of the stalled airframe and their high altitude. The thin air at 35,000 feet offers little support for lift, and as the descent continued, the options became more limited. Each movement of the control stick, each input, was a desperate attempt to stabilize an aircraft on the brink of collapse. The pitot tubes, the initial culprits in this tragic sequence, remained iced over, denying the crew access to accurate airspeed readings. Without this vital information, they were left in a deadly guessing game. The more they tried to correct the pitch, the more they descended. The captain's commands to level the wings went unheard as the aircraft continued to shake, vibrating under the strain of their descent. The stall warnings persisted, a reminder of the critical aerodynamic failure that gripped the plane. In the cockpit recordings recovered later, the final minutes reveal a tense, almost frantic atmosphere. Voices overlap, commands are repeated, and silence fills the gaps where words fail. As the A330 plummeted toward the ocean, it became clear that the crew was out of options. With no visibility of the ocean below in the pitch-black night and no reference points to gauge their altitude, the descent ended abruptly as the plane struck the Atlantic Ocean's surface. The impact was instant. The vast Atlantic, which had once been their pathway to Paris, became the final resting place for flight AF447. The crash resulted in the tragic loss of all 228 lives on board, marking one of the most haunting moments in aviation history. But this wasn't just a loss. It was a turning point. The last moments of AF447 highlighted the complex interplay of human error and technological limitations. The tragic ending brought a new awareness of how critical communication, situational awareness, and advanced training are in crisis scenarios. The insights gained would pave the way for improved protocols, aiming to prevent similar tragedies in the future. The crash of AF447 sent shockwaves through the aviation industry, sparking immediate investigations and prompting new standards for flight safety. The accident underscored a critical vulnerability: how both human errors and technological limitations could intertwine, creating a chain of events that led to catastrophic consequences. The aviation community took these insights seriously, recognizing that fundamental changes were necessary to prevent future incidents. One of the most significant takeaways was the need for enhanced pilot training, particularly in handling high-altitude stalls and interpreting confusing or conflicting data. Many airlines introduced new training programs focusing on manual flying skills. helping pilots build the confidence to take control in emergencies rather than relying solely on automated systems. These training updates emphasized better communication and coordination in the cockpit, ensuring that each crew member understood their role and responded as a unified team, especially during high-stress situations. Additionally, improvements were made to the design and maintenance of pitot tubes to reduce the risk of icing, which had been a crucial factor in the AF447 disaster. Regulations were updated to mandate more rigorous testing and monitoring of these sensors, so they could withstand extreme conditions like those faced in the intertropical convergence zone. These technical upgrades represented a commitment to addressing the mechanical vulnerabilities exposed by the incident. The legacy of AF447 is one of hard-earned knowledge. Although it came at a heavy cost, the insights from this tragedy continue to shape the principles of modern aviation safety. This tragic event reinforced the importance of proactive learning and adaptation, highlighting that even in the most advanced systems, human judgment and preparedness remain essential. The tragedy of AF447 serves as a solemn reminder of the balance between human skill and technological dependency in aviation. This simulation allowed us to glimpse the intense moments that defined that fateful flight, shedding light on the invaluable lessons it brought to the industry. As viewers, we're left not only with a deeper understanding of what went wrong, but also with a renewed respect for the complexity of air travel. If this exploration resonated with you, consider sharing this video to raise awareness about aviation safety. Together, we can honor those lost by supporting a future with safer skies.